The air inside Hitsville, USA smelled like burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls over a decade of recording sessions. It was the spring of 1970, and the building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit had produced more hit singles than most record labels would see in a lifetime. Gold records hung in rows along the corridors, each one a trophy, each one a reminder of what Motown was and what it expected from the people who walked through its doors. The hallways were narrow, the ceilings low, and somewhere deep inside that building, behind the heavy soundproof door of Studio A war was quietly beginning. Gordy had built Motown from nothing. He had started with an $800 loan from his family and turned it into the most successful black-owned business in American history. He understood the market, he understood radio programmers, and he understood exactly what kind of music sold records in 1970. Love songs, danceable rhythms, safe aspirational pop that crossed racial lines and moved units. That formula had worked for a decade, and Gordy saw no reason to abandon it. He had taken the raw talent of dozens of artists and shaped it into something commercially unbeatable, and he expected every artist on his roster to understand that the machine came first. That was the deal. That was always the deal. Marvin Gaye had been one of his most reliable assets, the Prince of Soul, the smooth baritone who could sell romance to a stone wall. His voice had been the engine behind millions of sold records, dozens of hit singles, and a public image that Motown had carefully constructed over the course of nearly a decade. Marvin was Motown's product, polished and packaged, and Gordy assumed that relationship was permanent and unconditional. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The sessions that would eventually become What's Going On had started quietly, almost privately. Marvin had been listening to his brother Frankie talk about Vietnam, about the bodies, about the confusion and the moral devastation of coming home to a country that had sent young men to die without ever really explaining why. Marvin had been listening to the news, watching the protests, sitting in rooms where people wept openly about a world that felt like it was coming apart at the seams. And somewhere in that grief, a record began to form in his mind. Not a love record, not a dance record, something harder, something more honest, something that nobody in Motown's conference rooms had asked for, and nobody in Motown's conference rooms was going to understand. When Marvin brought the recordings to Gordy, the response was immediate and brutal. Gordy listened, and his face did not change into the expression of a man who had just heard something important. It changed into the expression of a businessman who had just been handed a problem. The music was too soft, too political, too loose. There was a jazz influence that radio programmers were going to resist, and the lyrics were not the kind of thing that got played between car commercials on top 40 stations. Gordy's verdict was delivered without much ceremony. This wasn't what Motown needed. This wasn't what the market wanted. And this was not, under any circumstances, going to be released as a Marvin Gaye album on the Tamla label. The meeting did not go quietly. According to people who were present or who heard about what happened in the hours that followed, Gordy's dismissal of the album was not gentle. He called it uncommercial. He called it confused. He used words that were meant to close the conversation rather than continue it. And at some point, somewhere in that exchange, his hand came down on the surface of the mixing console or the table hard enough to make the room feel different. Not a suggestion, not a note, a declaration. This was Gordy telling Marvin Gaye, in the language that powerful men use when they want to remind you who has the final word, that the answer was no. Marvin stood in that room and absorbed it. People who knew him understood that the stillness that came over him in moments like this was not passivity. It was not submission. It was the particular silence of a man who has decided something and is simply waiting for the right moment to say it. He had spent years performing the role that Motown had assigned him, years of singing songs about love and longing and romantic fantasy for audiences who adored him and a label that owned him. He had been obedient in the way that the industry required obedience, and he had swallowed the compromises that came with that arrangement. But What's Going On was not a compromise. It was the first thing he had made that felt entirely true, and he was not going to let it disappear into a drawer because Gordy couldn't figure out how to sell it. The ultimatum Marvin delivered has been described in slightly different ways depending on who tells the story, but the core of it has never changed. He told Gordy that if What's Going On was not released, he would not record another note for Motown. Not a single, not a session, not a note. He was done. The relationship, the contract, the entire carefully constructed arrangement between Marvin Gaye and Berry Gordy's empire would be finished, and Gordy could keep the gold records on the wall as a souvenir of what used to be. For a man like Gordy, this was not a message he received easily. He had heard artists threaten to leave before. He had watched egos flare up and demand things and eventually back down when the reality of the music industry reminded them how difficult life was without the machine behind you. Motown was the machine, and the machine had made Marvin Gaye famous, comfortable, and beloved by millions of people who had never heard of him before Berry Gordy put his voice on the radio. The expectation was that Marvin would remember this and behave accordingly. The expectation was that after the anger cooled, after a day or two of silence, Marvin would come back and agree to record something that actually fit the formula. That expectation miscalculated who Marvin Gaye had become. What Gordy didn't fully understand, or perhaps refused to accept, was that the man standing across from him in that moment was not the compliant artist who had recorded pop hits on command throughout the 1960s. Tammy Terrell had died just months earlier, her brain consumed by a tumor while Motown had kept pushing her to record. Marvin had watched the label treat her suffering as a scheduling inconvenience, had seen what happened when the machine decided that product mattered more than people. He had buried something in himself when he buried her, and what grew in that space was not softer or more manageable. It was harder, more certain, and far less willing to bend. He had also been talking to his brother. Frankie had come home from Vietnam carrying stories that the news didn't tell and the government didn't want told. Young men in rice paddies dying for reasons that dissolved under examination. A country spending its wealth on destruction while its own cities burned and its own children went hungry. These were not abstract political positions to Marvin. They were the shape of his grief, the texture of his rage, the reason that What's Going On could not be a love song, no matter how much Berry Gordy needed it to be. So Marvin went back to the music, not to revise it, not to make it more palatable or more commercial or more suited to the demographic charts that Motown's marketing department was consulting. He went back to it to make sure it was exactly what he needed it to be, which meant it was exactly what he believed the world needed to hear. The album breathed. It flowed from track to track without the hard stops that radio programmers preferred, which was exactly the point. It was a continuous piece of music about a continuous wound, and interrupting it for station identification would miss the whole point entirely. The engineers who worked with Marvin on those final sessions described a man who was operating on a frequency that wasn't entirely of this world. He wasn't producing a record in the conventional sense. He was channeling something. The vocal performances he laid down during those sessions have been analyzed and discussed and admired for more than 50 years, and what makes them remarkable is not technical perfection. It's the sense that the voice is reaching for something just beyond the edge of what language can carry, pushing into the space where music goes when words are not enough. Marvin knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was unlike anything he had made before. He also knew it was the only honest response he had to the world he was living in. Gordy eventually relented. The accounts vary on exactly what shifted his position, whether it was Marvin's absolute refusal to back down, or whether someone in Gordy's circle made him understand that releasing the album was less dangerous than losing Marvin entirely. What is documented is that What's Going On was released on May 21st, 1971, and that the charts did not do what Berry Gordy had predicted. The first single entered the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed faster than almost anything Motown had released in years. Radio programmers, who had supposedly been unwilling to play political soul music, played it constantly. Audiences who had been listening to Marvin Gaye sing about romance for a decade discovered that his voice applied to something larger than a love story was almost unbearably powerful. The full album followed, and the response was not merely commercial. Critics who had long treated Motown as a hit factory rather than a serious artistic enterprise began writing about What's Going On in terms usually reserved for jazz or classical music. They wrote about its architecture, its coherence, the way it sustained an emotional argument across an entire side of vinyl without losing the thread. They wrote about the production, the layered vocals, the decision to let the music breathe in ways that radio-ready singles never did. They wrote, in short, about the things that Gordy had told Marvin nobody would care about. Gordy later acknowledged that he had been wrong. The admission, by his own account, was not difficult to make because the evidence was impossible to argue with. What's going on became not just a successful record, but the record, the one that changed the language of what soul music was allowed to say and how it was allowed to say it. It is on every serious list of the most important albums ever made. Rolling Stone has placed it at the #1 position among the greatest albums of all time. The music that Gordy slammed his hand down to prevent from existing is now considered the high water mark of everything Motown's artists were capable of producing. But the significance of what happened in that room in Detroit in 1970 is not reducible to chart positions or critical rankings. What happened was that a man who had every structural reason to give in decided not to. Marvin Gaye had less power than Gordy by every conventional measure. He was the artist, not the executive. He was the employee, not the owner. He owed Motown his career in the sense that the industry measures these debts. And he stood in that room and told the most powerful man in black music that power was not the final word on what mattered. There is something that cannot be manufactured in that moment. No formula produces it. No amount of market research identifies it in advance. It is the specific courage of a person who has decided that the thing they are making is more important than the safety of making something easier, and who is willing to accept every consequence of that decision. Marvin Gaye was not operating from a position of comfort when he made What's Going On. He was grieving. He was angry. He was surrounded by a system designed to convert his talent into someone else's profit. And from that position, he made the most important record of his life. The hand that came down on that console was supposed to end the conversation. Instead, it marked the moment when Marvin Gaye stopped being Motown's best asset and became something that no label could own. An artist who had decided, once and for all, that the music came first. Have you ever had to fight a whole system just to show them your true soul? Tell us your story in the comments.